It's been nearly 40 years since the spinners flew the streets of Blade Runner, and our dreams of a robot dystopia have washed away in the acid rain. Los Angeles, November 2019 is the date and place Ridley Scott's Blade Runner was originally set. As I look outside the window of our LA recording studio, we are supposed to be seeing a fleet of autonomous blimps drifting about above us, calling us to the off-world colonies. The AI replicants were to be walking amongst us in the cavernous streets, cast in the shadows of a scorched climate and the reflection of noodle bar neon. But long after the flickering hiragana has faded, narratives of human-like artificial intelligence spiraling out of control still permeate all forms of popular culture. In most of these stories, AI means robots, sentient, with a consciousness that mirrors our own. Super soldiers, sex bots, domestic help, and humanoid machine laborers liberating us from work, fulfilling our desires, going places we fear to tread, rising up, taking over, and doing away with our outdated, fragile bodies. In the imaginary worlds of science fiction, we've always explored the fears and wonders of AI technology. It is often through fiction that we can begin to understand what a particular technology might mean to us. Stories can shape our perception of technology, and in turn can influence how these technologies might evolve. For Fear and Wonder's third edition, we focused on the representations of AI in popular culture, and we brought together scientists, technologists, and creators from the entertainment industry to explore where the science ends and the fiction takes over.
A lot of those visions, if you will, Terminator, Skynet, etc., they talk about one end point of where AI might be or might go to.
I don't know.
The AI story seems a little similar to like iRobot or 2001, where the robots trying to do their best to do what we want them to do. It ends up backfiring, kind of like the monkey's paw when you ask it to keep you safe, and it kills everyone else to make sure you're safe.
Keep Summer safe.
Hey, man! What the hell? That was my daughter's pediatrician!
No! Stop! Don't kill him!
Design and post really did stem from the ideology that they were supposed to mirror humans themselves. And the creators of the park are not too dissimilar from us being the designers of the show. The second the show starts to look artificial, there's a subconscious disbelief in the viewer that this is not a real world that they're engaging in. These are not real emotions and connections they're having to their characters.
Dreams don't mean anything, Dolores. That answer doesn't seem to satisfy you.
Stories are time weapons because you write them and you have no idea when they're going to change someone's way of thinking way, way, way down the line. And I feel like the same could really be said for any kind of mode of storytelling.
Victor Martinez is a concept designer for film and TV who has given form to so many of the fictional futures of AI as he creates props, characters, and environments for story worlds such as Blade Runner 2049, the Terminator franchise, Real Steel, and Transcendence.
It's a fine line between wanting to predict the future versus wanting to sort of reflect people's speculations of what the future would be. Blade Runner 2049, I think it is a world post-climate change. It is a world post-disaster, and not really knowing where the human race is at this point in history. It speaks to those issues, and when we were designing those environments, we absolutely were looking at different places in the world today where you can't help but see the effects of climate change and global warming, and just that sort of thick fog and smog of the LA city in 2049 is a reminder that there are places like this in the world today. And when you see the expanse of the city and all the slums and overpopulation, it's very real, again, in cities all over the world. So we're definitely trying to get a response from the audience because it is something that is on everybody's minds, or should be, and these issues definitely play themselves out on the screen.
The two emergent trends that are most defining the future right now seem to be increasing applications of data-driven network systems and ecological collapse. And the ways that those two things are kind of part of the same story is it's not a kind of commonly articulated narrative.
This is artist and writer Ingrid Burrington. Ingrid researches the cultural, geological, and ecological consequences of technologies such as AI.
The environmental impacts of computational systems is still relatively small compared to like all of petroleum, but it is a growing one, and it's not necessarily resources running out per se. The question is really kind of like, how much more desperate to get materials will we become? Climate change and environmental collapse are mostly going to be affecting people who have already been deemed disposable by white, supremacist, capitalist, Western nations. So many popular Hollywood sci-fi AI narratives actually could be treated as just like really interesting analyses of whiteness. And actually, Blade Runner has this sort of interesting dynamic, because if you think of the replicants, the characters who Deckard hunts down, they're literally runaway slaves, right? And the like question of whether Deckard is a replicant or not introduces this thing of, is a replicant's personhood or ability to live with a certain degree of autonomy and dignity in a society only determined by his or her ability to further dehumanize others?
The worlds of fiction we construct are never benign or neutral. The imaginary worlds and cities of popular culture are encoded with the hopes and dreams, fears and anxieties of the time in which they are made. They are simultaneously reflections of who we are and projections of who we might want to be. Such visions are both products of culture and in turn produce culture. So what might the right stories we should be telling about AI be? What are the unhelpful or potentially dangerous stories we should be avoiding? Ideology rarely evolves at the pace of our technology, and systems such as AI often arrive into the world before our cultural understanding of what they might mean for us does. Fictional worlds act as a site in which to rapidly prototype the cultural consequences of emerging technologies and to help us create a public debate around our shared futures. John Carlos is the supervising art director for HBO's series Westworld. John has been designing the fictional amusement park of Westworld, a landscape populated by artificially intelligent androids and catering to high-paying guests who indulge themselves without fear of retaliation from the hosts, who are prevented by their programming from harming humans.
There is very specific written content provided to us by the creators of the show. There is great discussion and research on current technologies that are being evolved that then do inspire us as we are taking it one step further into where we think those technologies will be in 10, 20, 30, 40 years from now. The scary thing is that sometimes film inspires reality, and sometimes reality inspires film.
Are you real?
Well, if you can't tell, does it matter?
As they begin to gain consciousness of their own emotional consciousness, their own drives being narrated by themselves rather than dictated by code, they begin to experience their own controlled emotions of fear, of loss, of gain, of struggle, in a narrative that they're defining on their own.
Veronica So is the producer of artist Ian Cheng's AI-driven virtual life form called Bob. Over the course of its lifetime, Bob's body, mind, and personality evolve to better confront the continuous stream of life's surprises and metabolize them into familiar routines.
One thing that we really loved is giving AI a home, giving AI its own space and its own baseline for its existence. AI should not float freely around, live in your space. It should really have its own place to kind of be its own being, and you see it living its own internal life. That was something interesting that came up in our process of thinking about AI.
Director Jessica Brilhart thinks about how immersive media and virtual reality can connect audiences to complex ideas around technology.
For a long time, I was a filmmaker in the traditional sense who was also very interested in technology, and they were seen as mutually exclusive fields. And the through line through both of it was the humanness. It's the imperfections and the ways that we, regardless of the medium that we use to chat, we still find ways of creating long silences. We still find ways of being passive aggressive. We still find ways of telling someone we love them without saying that we love them. So I think that there are these human traits that transcend the hardware and the technology. I feel like being immersed doesn't necessarily mean high fidelity all the time. I think you can actually get through to people using really basic elements. And there's an artfulness and a craft there that I think could be explored.
It really starts to affect the people who interact with Bob. Some people really want to please Bob. They really want to be Bob's friend. Or some people are tricksters and they really want to trick Bob and throw it some curveballs. And all the different kinds of motivations behind what people do really change Bob's course of life.
An AI like Bob is very different to the human-like robots we see in most contemporary science fiction. Real AI is infrastructural, simple operating systems and management protocols, batch processing large amounts of data, not plotting revolutions and liberation. They are ingrained in our lives, embedded in the ground of the earth and the fabric of the modern city. It doesn't fit the model of classic Hollywood narratives, but today the front line of robotics and automation is found in large-scale shipping ports, endless factory floors, vast agricultural fields, social networks, and urban utilities. Siddharth Suri is a computational social scientist who studies the crowd workers who manage modern artificial intelligence systems. For Sid, the real robots of technology are ourselves, our bodies repurposed as a component embedded within an AI machine network.
In the here and now, human beings power these systems. That's going to be true, I would bet, for the rest of my life. So what a lot of people don't realize is machine learning systems, they learn by example. And who gives them the examples? The answer is human labor. So think about Facebook or Twitter or Instagram. All of these companies have content policies. No graphic violence, no hate speech, no adult content, et cetera, et cetera. Now, obviously, no human or group of humans can look at every piece of content on one of these platforms. So algorithms do. Well, how does an algorithm learn what is adult content or what isn't? And the answer is human beings labeling content as adult or not is what teaches these systems. The reason why we use the term ghost work is because the work and the workers are hidden. What I'd like to shift the conversation to is, let's look at the workers we're using now. Let's celebrate them and their accomplishments and their achievements and their contributions so that wherever we do end up, we can say we at least got there in a fair, ethical way.
What are the stories we could tell that imagine the implications of what AI is truly becoming? Can the real science of AI shape more nuanced and complex fictional worlds? Because the assumptions and decisions that underpin our speculative futures of AI will form the foundation for generations of autonomous machines to follow. How we engage with these artificial intelligences of fiction is already shaping our expectations for the next generation of human-machine interactions.
It's interesting because Rick and Morty is so unique in that it's so scientific. When I worked on a show like King of the Hill, a prop designer might design a barbecue or a cup, things that we all know and exist in this world, but on Rick and Morty, every episode is like, it's so scientific. With the summer story, one of the things that we had to figure out visually is what is the car? Like Hal in 2001 is like a round eye. Some of the things we thought of doing is like have a sine wave to show that it was talking to her, but in the end we arrived at just sort of a glow that pulsed just to show how surrounded by the entire technology she was and the inability she had to do anything about it.
What are we going to do now?
I am unable to destroy this army. To clarify, I am quite able to destroy this army, but you will not permit it.
Correct.
You also refuse to authorize emotional countermeasures.
That was Dominic Polsino, director of the iconic episode of Rick and Morty in which Summer attempts to convince Rick's driverless car that it shouldn't harm any humans that run against its programming. Deborah Harrison is one of the personality architects of Microsoft's Cortana digital assistant. In a process very much like a writer's room for a sitcom, Harrison and her team designed the principles of such an AI's decision-making processes and responses.
And one of my first jobs there was to design a set of principles that help govern how she would speak and how she would talk, and indeed would we call her she in the first, for example.
Some people just really like the feeling of having a companion or a friend, so they wouldn't necessarily ask me to do anything. They would just kind of check in every once in a while or want to tell me stories. It's hard because we weren't really built with an intuition for what it means to interact or have such an intimate relationship with some of these systems. And so through my work, I'm trying to create moments where that abstract idea becomes tangible and becomes personal, and we can kind of understand it on a human scale.
Lauren McCarthy finds the human stories within technology and explores how our personal relationships skew and shift when we share our lives with the network of artificially intelligent things. Lauren lived the role of a real-life digital assistant, on call 24/7, performing the duties we normally assign to our domestic AI.
So a lot of the process was kind of the everyday things, turn this on or heat up this water or unlock the door. But then there were these moments where I think people kind of took advantage of this mix of like human and posing as AI system. So they would ask me sometimes to like read them stories on end. So that means I'm typing and it's like speaking in bit by bit to them.
It'll make you feel better.
You hate that book.
I don't want to read either.
Let's dance.
Do you want to dance, or do you want to open your present?
What present?
This one.
What's the occasion?
Let's just say it's our anniversary.
Is it?
An area that I'm really interested in is how we handle what we call sensitive content, so the abusive or difficult language that is always offered upon bots if you open a conversational space, even if they're not designed to do that. And so our understanding of how to handle those kinds of sensitive scenarios has been evolving ever since we began working on it. We're thinking about how do you model healthy boundaries, given that the boundaries we're establishing are on behalf of this imaginary entity. And yet, the way that we respond is in effect offering a template for how people might respond to each other, and certainly for how we allow or encourage people to talk to these agents. The second most common thing I get asked is, why don't you make my children say thank you? And that's a really interesting question, because is it our job to ask anybody to say thank you? And a thing that I find interesting is that grown-ups never ask me why we don't make them say thank you. They only ask it on behalf of children. So we're thinking about what are the social norms, and so how do we then expand our consciousness to think about what things are we missing, and how do we bring that in, and then how do we apply what we're learning to make a call about what it is our agents are going to encourage or discourage around discourse.
It is not dystopian AI out of control, or AI that is going to solve all the world's problems for us, but instead we must understand AI as simultaneously utopian and dystopian. It is a technology that is an extension of ourselves, coded with our own bias and contradictions, quirks and charms. The future narrative of AI is not latex-skinned, humanoid-shaped robots. Rather, it's complex relationships with driverless cars, mirrored black rectangles, giant infrastructural objects, and planetary-scaled logistical systems. Imaginary worlds shaped by this grounded understanding of AI can begin to help us engage with and make sense of these emerging technologies.
We bond with our pets, when we bond with fictional characters, we just trust them because they don't remind us of ourselves, and they don't remind us of other people that we love and don't want to disappoint. Bob being a very weird, serpentine, branching character is something that is really useful.
In the beginning, we ask ourselves, how much are the hosts like us? But towards the end, we start asking, how much are humans like the host? And what can we learn and gain from them?
I think the problematic word is author and creativity, because those words have applied to human activities for our entire history. We've never considered them in the context of something non-human performing those functions.
Ross Goodwin helped conceive Sunspring, a science fiction short film entirely written by an artificial intelligence bot he trained on science fiction novels.
Dijkstra in the 60s said, asking whether a machine can think is like asking whether a submarine can swim, meaning that it's a language problem. I really hope that our film accomplished that particular goal of setting writing free. You know, we talk about the camera in the 19th century, and people say that, well, the camera set painting free because all of a sudden anyone could produce a photorealistic image. Well, neural networks are cameras for writing, they're cameras for images that don't exist, pushing storytelling forward, asking new questions about what stories are. I mean, we've been telling the same stories as humans for probably the better part of 50,000 years. So I think it's time for us to evaluate where we are in terms of the types of narratives we've been creating. You know, what stories haven't we told yet?
The future does not rush over us like water. It is something we all actively shape and define, and these types of stories can help us start asking more questions of the technologies that are going to define our lives, spaces, and cities. This is a call to arms, a hope that we may all keep making stories that become vessels for critical ideas, Trojan horses hidden within the mediums of popular culture. There be monsters off the map, but the more we envision speculative new worlds, the uncharted territories where they might dwell get that little bit smaller. As the blimp drifts out of sight, the neon fades and the androids power down, our science fiction safari through the imagined futures of AI will finally return us to where we first started, to look back on our contemporary technologies and to see them again with new eyes, and collectively discuss where we might want to go next.